All right, welcome everyone. My name is Tommaso. I'm the president of the Politics and International Relations Society at the University of Kent, and we're delighted to be joined today by Jess Phillips, the MP for Birmingham Yardley and the Shadow Minister for Domestic Violence and Safeguarding. She's also the author of the wonderful book Every Woman, which is an incredibly good read and sort of dissects the problems in British and how they're reflected in Westminster. So thank you so much for being here. I'll start off with a few questions and then we'll move on to the audience Q&A. So if anyone would like to ask a question, they can use the raise hand function or type it in the chat. I wanted to start with your journey into politics. How did you become an MP, and what experiences prior to becoming an MP helped you shape into the member of parliament you are?
Okay, well, it's not like a linear narrative. It's like a David Lynch film, I'm afraid. First and foremost, I would say my childhood was deeply political. I was raised by very politically active parents, not like with political positions particularly, well, not at all. So they were never representatives or anything, but they were activists, both for the Labour Party, but also for various causes, whether that's the union movement. My dad was a teacher, and we always seemed to be campaigning for dinner ladies' pay and issues around what kids should and shouldn't be learning. My mum was a women's rights activist, and along with other friends of hers and women in the local community, would do things like set up childcare cooperatives. I went to a playgroup that was called Women's Liberation Playgroup, that was basically set up by a group of women because there was no formalised childcare. So I was raised in the crucible of not just political activism for political activism's sake, but political activism that had a direct lived consequence for both, well, for my family and our community. So that is, you know, always like sort of an inspiring place to grow up in. But then, and I was always interested in politics. I was always forced to campaign, and I wanted to be a politician until in 1997, I did my work experience. I was 16, so I wasn't able to vote in 1997, but Tony Blair and the Labour government had just come to power, and it was the 50th anniversary of the NHS. And I did my work experience at this big conference that was celebrating the 50th anniversary of the NHS. And Tony Blair came, and I worked in the press office. And I thought in that moment, I could never be a politician, certainly not a high ranking politician, because I would hate everything to be as planned as everything seemed, like down to like who they were going to shake hands with. It like seemed so organized, and I thought, God, I'm not fit for this world. I'm going to have to be one of the people who sits in the background. And so I got much more interested in looking at policy, and I did social policy at university. And then when I graduated from university, I worked in various voluntary sector organisations, both directly as a sort of care worker and support worker, but also looking at how policy should be changed to better improve the lives of the people that they serve, to young offenders, asylum seekers, victims of domestic abuse and sexual violence. And it was in that role really then, that working at Women's Aid, that I started to be a bit like, well, actually, I think I'm going to have to step up to the plate again. I'm going to have to, if you want to change something and if you want something to be better for a group of people, then you have to do something about it. And you can't just, if not you, then who, sort of thing. And also Wendy, a woman I work with, she and I had a bet over who could become an MP first, and she put literally zero effort in. And she just like, I was like, Wendy, I thought it was like genuinely doing this. And I ended up a member of parliament. Wendy, still very much working in modern slavery policy in the Black Country. So I don't know who's the winner in that scenario, actually. I think it might be Wendy. But it was, there was a couple of moments along the way where I thought, you should do this. And they almost all coincided with me having to lose my imposter syndrome, to think that being a member of parliament was for somebody else. And one of those moments was with Chris Grayling. He was then the Justice Secretary, Secretary of State for Justice, a man so ill-suited for the role, as the fact that he didn't have imposter syndrome is a shocker. Went to a meeting with him around the privatisation of probation, and I was working in female offenders services at the time. He knew so little about it. So many people were wrong. He didn't know what he was talking about. And I thought, this state for justice, without knowing even the first thing about prisons, like, this is unbelievable. And then I thought, I can do it. If Chris Grayling can be the Secretary of State for Justice, I can be the leader of the free. And turns out there was an even better who was the leader of the free world, who definitely should have had imposter syndrome. And so at that moment in that meeting, I thought, well, look, if I want to change this, if these people are getting this policy so wrong all the time because they don't have lived experience, they don't have employment experience in the very things they control, then people like me have got to step up to the plate and get ourselves elected. And so that's what I did.
Right. Yeah. And in your book, you talk a little bit about this lived experience, and you have a journey prior to politics that's maybe untraditional for Westminster, but traditional for everyone else in Britain. So how did that lived experience? I mean, you talk about your brother's struggles with addiction and rough sleeping, with seeing friends sexually harassed and assaulted. How did that lived experience then reflect into the job you do today?
I mean, my lived experience, and actually what I didn't say before, is the single job I think I had. Most people, if there was one job that everybody had before being in Westminster, it's lawyer. Lawyer is the most common one, I think. And there's quite a smattering of doctors. There's a couple of teachers. There's quite a lot of people from the trade union movement, as you might expect. But the job that I think I did that was the single greatest training to be a frontline politician, and that was that I was a barmaid for 5 years, and that taught me that I basically can have very long and laborious conversations with people who sometimes don't know what they're talking about, often disagree with you completely and utterly, and yet you still have to, maintain sort of happiness and desire to actually spend time talking to people who aren't necessarily all like you, and also it gives you the gift of the gab, and I can shout really loud because of it, which is really helpful in Parliament. Yeah, my lived experience working in bars, knowing lots of people who had been at the very sharpest end of life, growing up in a family where people are still, some of my family are still benefit dependent. My brother Joe, when he was waiting for his universal credit claim to come in, said that in protest he wasn't going to shave until, because they say it takes 5 weeks, ha ha ha, they've obviously never claimed it, that he would grow his beard, and he looked like Rasputin by the time he got his first benefit payment. So that lived experience, the lived experience of my constituents. My experience is no different to my constituents. Every single one of my constituents has in their family somebody who struggled like my brother Luke struggled. Everybody has had a period pretty much where, the fact that they paid in meant that they got something back from the system when they needed it. Everybody has, been worried about being made redundant and not had secure employment or secure tenancies. Like, that's a really universal experience. And every single day, I try and take that into my job, and speak with the authenticity that gives me. Sometimes you can get treated as if you're shroud waving or acting up because you talk about your own lived experience, and people always say, oh, it's me. That's a common thing that people will say, but the reality is, if we don't talk about real lives and real experiences, the same people will always rise to the top, and politics will always be fundamentally about the same thing. That it's always been about. And I have been lectured by, I remember one time falling out with I actually get on with him quite well, which is jarring. There's nothing about us that would ever get on, but is a member of parliament who is a decorated military man. And whether we were talking about something to do with, I think, airdrops in Syria, and he, like, you know, me, and it was in fact my late friend Joe Cox at the time, were arguing for sort of air cover for ground aid being taken in on the ground in Aleppo. And he basically sort of stopped me in the corridor and said, well, what do you know about matters of war? You've never been on the front line. What do you know about matters of war? Because he is a man who's been on the front line. And I just turned around to him and I said, have you ever voted on anything to do with family allowance and maternity leave? What do you know? You've never, you don't even have a womb to be populated with a baby. And yet you voted on things that control my womb. So mind your manners. Don't talk down to me as if my life experience as a woman with children when I was young, who survived on benefits and needed things like Sure Start. Why is that life? Why isn't that the same? Considered the same as a soldier? There's no word in Parliament for my life experience. There's a special word if you're a soldier. If you've been a soldier, you're gallant. That's you say the gallant gentleman. If you're a lawyer, they say learned. We need to come up with a word that says, you know, actually lived a bloody life. What's that word?
Yeah, and I mean, I think this sort of, speaking of that, how many lawyers are in Parliament sort of leads us to the current Labour Party.
Like the top dog lawyer. We've got the top one. If you're going to have a lawyer, have the top one.
But in all seriousness, Keir Starmer is, you know, kind of has had the traditional path into Parliament. He was a lawyer. He's from London. How does Keir Starmer and this new iteration of the Labour Party represent the future for Britain, and how can it distinguish itself from the Tories?
Oh, I think it distinguishes itself from the Conservative Party relatively easily by having a heart and soul that actually means something beyond a slogan. Like, you know, there's saying you care about people's lives and then actually rolling up your sleeves and doing the work to change people's lives. And I think that the Tories don't do anywhere near enough of the latter, and a Labour Party that can be relied on and trusted, which is, you know, by no means a given, and something that has to be earned. And hasn't been earned yet, and so needs to be. So how does the current Labour Party do that? I think that Keir Starmer does it not on his own. He does it with a team of people. And to be fair to him, not really had any opportunities to act like a team. Is it? He's allowed to see 6 people at any one time since he became the leader of the Labour Party. I've been in a room with him once, I think. Not even, but it was a massive room. It was Westminster Hall. It's a huge room. So it wasn't like we could have a proper meeting or anything. So I think that, you know, Keir Starmer presents to the electorate something that much of the electorate want. They want somebody who is credible, trustworthy, who looks out to the nation as a safe pair of hands in a time when really people feel a bit rudderless at the moment and flux in society because, like, you know, even I don't know what we're going back to after the pandemic. But then he has other people around him that will do other things. And, you know, me and Keir Starmer are not the same politician. There's no two ways about that. You know, but we are on the same team. And actually, we fundamentally, to quote Gloria Estefan, which I'm sure at a university-based thing, it's going to really, loads of you are going to know, we dream the same dream, we want the same things. And I might say it a little bit differently to the way that Keir Starmer says it, but we'll say it to different people and different people will be able to hear us saying it. And it's not just me and him, there's a whole variety of voices that have to be part of that. And I think that I would want to see a time where we move away from the idea that you have an all or nothing figurehead. It's not, in the places where politics has become that, I don't think it's been to the benefit of people. And even the when I think of the governments of my childhood, what I grew up with, the politics I grew up with, including Margaret Thatcher, who obviously was an enormous figurehead, she was the sum of her cabinet. You knew, like when I was a kid, you knew the names of everybody in the cabinet. Like, and under John Major, and I could still name them now. That's how sad I am. And Tony Blair similarly. Like, whilst they, you might have had somebody really leading out from the front who was seen as being the star. Actually, the idea of consensus government and Parliament taking part in that is something that we should get back to. Not just Boris Johnson standing at a plinth that he spent £2.6 million building. Honestly, I could have knocked it up for him for not even a grand. Me and my husband, we could have easily done that for him. I mean, we did our downstairs much better for much less. We did it all by ourselves. He's terrible. Mind you, my husband is like a tradesman, so maybe he gives me mates rates. But the truth is that we need to get back to that idea of a group sense of politics, not just all is lost on one person. Because do you know what? I can't even name some of the cabinet. If you were to quiz me now, I live in fear of this happening on the news. I'd be like, oh God, who is that one now? They're like, it's really nothingy, isn't it? It's like you don't get a sense of big beasts sat round a table arguing the toss for the right thing to happen. You feel like people are just giving out orders and just plough the line regardless of what they think. I don't think anyone in the cabinet stands up to Boris Johnson. Do you? I really don't. Whereas, maybe if you let me in the room, I would stand up to him.
Right. And you talk about this problem also existing in the Labour Party in the past. And there's a very good anecdote in your book about you being asked to walk up the stage with Jeremy Corbyn when he was giving a speech about women's issues. So yeah. How do we make sure that however much the shadow cabinet is diverse and represents different parts of life, they are not just, or you are not just tokenized, but actually these experiences reflect in the policy of the Labour Party?
Look, the reality is that if Labour women were brought along as tokens, they would speak up. The reality is actually even tokenism, whilst it seems jarring and it's painful, what I would assert that is if you're asked to be a token, make a demand. If you're asked to be a token, it's because they need a token that's like you that they don't have. Make a demand. And don't just use the tokenism. Sit in that meeting that you've been invited to, and speak up and say, well, actually, I don't agree with this, or actually, what about the women, or what are you going to do about this and that? I know that there are times in my political career where they've needed me to do something, and not just political parties, newspapers, businesses have been like asked me to go and give a speech about sexual harassment, and I've said to them, I can think of one very, very famous, enormous global company. I said to them, well, what's the data in your organization? I'll come and do this. What's the data in your organization last year for complaints about sexual harassment? They said, oh, it doesn't happen at our organization. And I just was like, because you're not collecting the data, is it? So I will come and do it when you tell me that you're going to start routinely collecting this data. And you have to, people will trade on you as an equality token all the time. So use it as a trading tool.
Yeah, no, that's a brilliant point. And I want to sort of shift gears here and move on to the pandemic. What do you see as the major problems that have sort of been brought to light during this pandemic, and how can these problems be addressed in the recovery?
The major problems that have been brought to light are something that many of us have known and could feel, but there wasn't a data source big enough to tell us that it was true. Although there were attempts at it in various things, but it has been writ large, that we live in an unequal society where if you're Black or Asian, you're more likely to die of a disease when there is one going round. Where if you're poor and you're more likely to die, or if you're a woman, and certainly if you're a mother, you're more likely to lose your job when jobs are being lost. So it has provided a huge amount of data sets that show that when a system is strength tested, that the weakest links are always the same people. It is women, Black and Asian people, migrant communities, poorer communities, in some cases rural communities, coastal communities. Like, you know, you could see where the stresses were, and what we have to do coming out of that is not just let it, you know, somebody sit on a digger and say, oh, it's all right, don't worry, the people of this enormous region where I'm assuming you're all the same person, even though there's about 19 different towns and cities within this area that I'm calling the North. Don't worry, here's a digger. We're gonna build back better. And here's our slogan that, you know, has nothing behind it that will address any of those equalities. The issues, and the biggest equality issue always, and that is never addressed, being that of class, of being people who have least always end up with least, if not less than the people before their parents before them. Now that should, every single politician in our country should literally not be able to sleep at night, while people who are born with less end up with less further. That's failure. That is a massive fail. And the pandemic has shown that when strength tested, our country fails under those circumstances. It absolutely wins and is successful in other circumstances. Like, you know, the collaboration, the global collaboration around the scientific advancements, and the willingness to put that money, and being able to quickly believe that we had clever people in our country that could act quickly. You know, that is, although we've been defunding science and research for a long time, nonetheless, you know, that you know, we're still a world leader. And there was other things that I think that we knew were good about Britain, that when strength tested, were found to be really as strong as we thought they were. And so we have to advance on the things that we are good at and make sure that that is shared by everybody, and that kids in my constituency grow up and think, I could be a microbiologist who one day creates a vaccine that saves the world, instead of it being, well, I might have a chance at work in retail, that when something bad happens, there's no jobs left in the thing that it was for people like me. That is a failure of Britain, that is what we were left with.
Right, yeah. And in recent years, another failure that has been highlighted but has always existed is the violence against women, or men's violence against women, especially in the wake of Sarah Everard's tragic murder. I have a few questions, but you, prior to working in Parliament, you worked at Women's Aid, as you mentioned, and so there you were confronted every day with victims of domestic abuse. What did you learn there about violence against women, and how can that be applied in sort of the government's response?
I mean, what I learned at Women's Aid, it is the greatest learning experience of my life, actually. Better than university, better than all of my years at school. It was the most fertile ground for learning things that even people like me thought I knew, as a sort of whip smart girl. But it taught me the thing that I think I didn't realise. I think we all know, and we've all seen on, you know, various soap operas or dramas, you know, somebody being bashed around by their aggressive husband. What it taught me working at Women's Aid was the sheer volume of this crime. It is happening on every single street. So I worked for a Women's Aid that, when I first started there, was initially just representing a borough called Sandwell, which is made up of 6 towns. It's, you know, not even, it's like a third of the size of a city like Birmingham. It's small. It's a small place, and every year we would have 12,000 cases on our books, with an additional 20,000 children. So you're talking tens of thousands of people in a tiny, and I had no idea of the sheer scale of sexual violence and domestic abuse that was going on. And what I didn't realise was that I thought that it was an issue about like people being drunk and losing control, and about women being more vulnerable in society because of various reasons. I had no idea that the whole, all violence against women and girls, in whatever form it is about power and control. And the reason that women become victims of it is because they are less powerful in society. They literally have less power. So men who abuse their wives, don't lose it with their bosses. They don't punch their bosses in their face because they've had a moment that needed anger management. When they're pissed, they don't pummel the life out of their mates. They control the people that they can control, and women and children have a lesser status in society and so can be controlled. And I learned about how deep-seated misogyny is, about how people and our system and our state genuinely blames people for falling prey to sexual violence, for example. And people do it because they want to believe that it won't happen to them. And it's a sort of protective characteristic where we go, well, why doesn't she leave? I think I would leave. Or, well, she was walking out late at night. And we do all of these things. And it's to make us feel as individuals like we would somehow be able to prevent this terrible thing happening to us and the people that we love. But we can't prevent it. There's nothing we can do to prevent it. Society has to prevent it. And the only thing that will actually ever do that is the equalisation of women and men. And so I fight for women's liberation in order to end violence against women and girls. But what we have to do, as I'm not foolish enough, I'm certainly not learned enough to know that, to think that I'm going to see the equalisation of men and women in my lifetime. I'm not going to see that. My nan lived through women being given the vote. She lived through a massive change, 100 years of change for women. And we weren't anywhere close by the time she died of being equal. I don't think I'll see it in my lifetime. In fact, I know I won't. So I have to look at the structural systems that victims interact with and perpetrators interact with to seek better solutions. And most people think that that's around criminal justice. It really is a tenth of the issue of violence against women and girls. It is mainly in how we administer our welfare system, how we administer our housing is vastly important, how we educate children and young people, and then allow education of lifelong learning. All of those things are actually more important than the criminal justice system. The criminal justice system interacts with less than 5% of all the cases, and it's still the biggest crime type. But then, of course, also you need to look at the structural issues and why our justice system frequently allows people to rape with impunity.
Right. Yeah. And in recent weeks, we've also seen government failings on violence against girls in schools, and that seems that there are certainly all these societal factors at play, but there are also some clear government policy responses that enacted. So could you talk a little bit about that and what you'd like to see?
There's literally no government policies have been acted with regard to sexual harassment in schools, even though the government have been being lobbied to do it by not just by people like me and organisations like you might imagine would agree with me, but by Conservative Party chairs of committees, actually. So this is by no means even a partisan thing, but the policies that we have to see is, well, there needs to be a policy about sexual harassment, peer-on-peer sexual harassment in school. Huge amounts of the safeguarding that exists in our country, the law around safeguarding and the practice and regulation and direction around safeguarding in this country, quite understandably, is about adults to children. And I can totally understand why people would be anxious about that, and I wouldn't seek to undermine that. But not addressing the issue of peer on peer. When I worked at Women's Aid, 10, 15 years ago, we were talking about how girls were ending up like in what they would call a lineup, which was just literally going along a line of boys and giving them blowjobs, and this was demanded of the girls in a school in the West Midlands. Like, you know, that this is not new. This sexual exploitation, sexual harassment, sexual violence amongst peer groups has been happening. Now, the reason we get nervous about it is because we don't, you know, people go, oh, we don't want to end up criminalizing loads of boys for banter. And so what we've done is we've basically left it on the shoulders of girls to deal with this. And they've decided that the way that they deal with it is we're just going to take it. We just take this violence. And that's what's been happening until recently, when they all just went, you know what, no more, I'm not having this anymore. This is what's been happening. So government policy that needs to happen is there needs to be clear, absolute accurate guidelines about what happens when there is an incidence of sexual violence in a school. There has to be a whole school approach and a strategy in every school for how they will prevent it. Just the same way in every single school in our country, there is a strategy for how they will improve attendance. You know, that should be lesser, in my opinion, than making sure that half of the population of your school feels safe in that environment. I'm a parent, and you know, my kids, when they're at school, like, you know, I can see that the Ofsted regime, the regime that monitors schools and assesses schools, like, it really matters. If you get a crappy score, people don't then want to get your kids to, it's really damaging for schools. And one of the things they measure against is attendance, and I can tell my kids are incentivized to want to go to school. They're like given pizzas if they have, you know, their class is the best attendance. They get a little badge at primary school. Like, loads is done. What is being done in the same way to make sure that boys are respecting girls? Like, you know, why aren't Ofsted? Why isn't there a little badge for that? Why is there not a pizza at the end of term because your class has, you know, done the most to make sure that everybody feels best? Like, where is, and the reason is because Ofsted don't monitor it. Ofsted don't look into it properly. And so schools who've got so much going on, like, you know, they're going to do the things that they get tested against, just like the kids are going to do the things that they get tested against. And if nobody's testing them against whether their school is a safe environment, then it won't be safe.
Yeah, and I mean, it's a similar problem at universities, where it often feels like universities take cases of plagiarism more seriously than cases of.
That's because they do. Universities, I'm going to be so bold now as to say, universities are the worst places for this in Britain. Actually, the stories I hear, and the trouble for universities is that this terrible sort of balancing act between and children's social care and care leavers, and in every single government policy this is a problem, is that it's really problematic for people to be over the age of 18, as if being over the age of 18 means consent is completely given at all times. This sort of cliff edge that is provided where you go from childhood to adulthood is, nobody quite knows how to set decent policy in that area that safeguards people properly. Because with the greatest respect to most university students, I am a different woman to the woman I was when I went to university, and actually I needed more safeguarding taken over me than I might do now. I still need some preventions in the places where I work and travel. I need some preventions put in place, but I needed more when I was at university, and I feel like the establishment never took account of that.
Right. Yeah, and we'll move on to those questions in a second. So if anyone has a question, please raise your hand. I just have one last question on this topic. Another issue has come up since the Sarah Everard murder, and that's that women are not always protected by law enforcement and by police. And Sarah Everard herself was murdered by an off-duty police officer.
Well, we don't know that yet.
Allegedly.
Allegedly, yeah.
But we do know about the scenes of violence at the vigil, and then violence that followed it in protests in Bristol. So how do we grapple with the fact that the police too often fail to protect women?
We have to front it out, I think, is the reality, and the police have to feel more confident about being able to talk about areas where they failed and where they need more resource and help. And that's the truth, because the police officers that I work with, lots of them, there's bad apples in every establishment. That's absolutely the case, and there will be bad apples in the police service, and because the eye of the storm is currently on them, we're going to see bad apple stories every week, and unfortunately that will erode the trust. But the police need to very, very quickly, for a start, first of all, get protocols in place around how they deal with internal complaint and criminal complaints about their own. And I think that is where currently the biggest mistrust exists, is that if a police officer commits a crime against anyone, but in this instance, against a woman, that they will be treated more favourably. And it may very well seem like that is the case, and there's a huge body of evidence, and in fact a super complaint currently going through the courts around that particular issue. But I can't say that I've seen that great a success of people going forward about rape or domestic abuse when the perpetrator isn't a police officer. So there's two things. They've got to get their own house in order and make very, very clear that people will be suspended, for example, on suspicion, and like you might imagine that they would be. That if there was a case against somebody at a school, you might imagine that they would be suspended, rightly on full pay, while investigations go on, and that they have processes in place to deal with that. And I think they need to be very clear and do quite a bit of work around that. But secondly, they need to accept that. And we need to front out the fact that a lack of trust in the police by victims, because no one ever gets convicted of rape, for example, is actually, it's not entirely, but it's largely not the police's fault. There is, sort of education piece that needs to be done with citizens around what the Crown Prosecution Service is, and the justice system, and all the different layers. And the police need to, I would say, that they are often the people who feel let down by the system as well. But the whole system needs to improve so that people can have faith in the police again. So I would say that the police have got to very much be joining the fight to be improving what happens upstream from them, because that's letting them down.
Yeah, brilliant. We'll go to questions. Also, if you have a question, feel free to type it in. Jack, you want to go ahead?
Was that me? Apologies.
Yeah.
Yeah. Hi. Yeah, I'm a proud alumnus of Kent, but I'm an either proud Brummie. So
I was going to say, you sound like a Brummie to me.
Yeah, I'm from Moseley.
Yeah, that's where I'm sitting right now. I'm in Moseley right now.
That's this. So we're right. Oh, sorry, we're going to get in a conversation. I'm right by the Prince of Wales. Prince of Wales pub is just there.
Well, you see, I'm slightly you're cool and urban. On the high street bit, I'm in the suburby bit. But we could. I might see you down the co-op later.
Maybe. I'll be the one with the Toblerone in my hand. But it was a real pleasure to listen to you speak. One of the kind of issues that have been highlighted by the pandemic, as you emphasise, is the issue of violence against women and girls. It's a strategic priority for the West Midlands Police, as I believe it is for a few police forces now. How, though, do the police, PCCs and agencies make this strategic priority effective when we know that so many victims of violence, particularly sexual violence, are reluctant to come forward in the first place to report their crimes? Dame Vera Bird's report last year highlighted that it's just 5% of rape survivors feel that going to the police is a route to justice. So how do we get to the process where we're seeing justice if there's no confidence at all that it's ever going to get there?
I mean, it's going to take time, and it's very difficult to put that on the shoulders of like an individual regional police force or a regional politician in charge of a police force. But the truth is that the West Midlands Police, like Nottingham, really were trailblazers, for example, in monitoring misogyny as a hate crime. before there was national legislation to demand that of forces, for example. And so actually I think that police forces, what they're going to have to do, and certainly an argument that we'll start to have nationally, is that resources need to be allocated based on crime harm versus volume. So if I were to just go volume, you would end up with, you know, murder getting less priority than car theft, which obviously nobody's going to argue for. So, but domestic violence, domestic abuse, I would say largely isn't allocated the same level of resource as it is crime volume within any police force area. And so I think that just improving the specialisms within police forces, which used to exist, I have to say, when I first worked at Women's Aid, and ensuring, for example, that we have specialist RASO units, so rape and serious sexual assault units in every police force area, where people can be trained and to be responsive in those circumstances has got to be the first place to start. But I think that we need a massive overhaul of the way that we handle rape. Scotland is just undertaking quite a serious look at exactly how trials work, and not just giving best evidence, which is the sort of thing we've been tinkering with around the edge for about the past decade, well, no longer than that, past 2 decades, around proper, for example, having proper advocacy. So rape victims, even though they might seem like the most important person in a case, are actually one of the least represented people in any case as it goes on. They're just a piece of evidence. They're merely a witness. They are not a fundamental part of the process. So the Crown and the police are represented by the Crown Prosecution Service, and the perpetrator has far greater access to what is going on because they have legal representation in the form of defence. Not going to argue against that, but I really feel like from the moment a victim ends up in the system, they need proper legal advocacy by trained lawyers who can guide them through the system and make sure that they're getting the best response from the CPS. You know, if you're writing to a lawyer of a victim rather than to the victim themselves, likelihood is you're going to check what you're saying. And so that is one policy that I would like to see enacted and has been costed out by the Labour Party. But, you know, before, you know, to get up to 10%, if in my lifetime we get up to 10% of people feeling confident, I'll feel like we've won. Yeah, the idea that we could ever have 100% of people who suffered sexual violence who felt like they could come forward, it's just a sort of priority. It's the sort of thing that you've just sort of kind of given up on. Like, I'd just like to see it doubled for now, but the government should have a direct target. Like, we care what we count. We count what we care about, rather. And the reality is they don't put measures on this. They don't want to see convictions doubled. They don't want to, you know, see more people coming. They don't have targets for more people coming forward even. So it's tricky.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
We got a question in the chat from Philip. In your view, has Theresa May done more good as Prime Minister or as a critic of the current government?
I mean, personally, I feel like I like it when she's a critic of the government, because she's a really good and caustic and measured critic of them. And criticism coming from her seems, especially on home affairs, gosh, you know, Theresa May knows her onions about anything it is about home affairs. She was probably the longest lasting. I mean, when it was a bit like the Sugar Babes when the Labour Party was in power, there seemed to be a new Home Secretary quite regularly. But Theresa May, 6 years I think she was the Home Secretary. That's got to be some kind of record in such a contentious department. Although people don't resign now, even when they should. I'm not suggesting that Theresa May necessarily. I think, although she was definitely responsible for the Windrush, she managed to dodge it by not being the Home Secretary at the time when it all came to the fore. But look, I think that her time in power as Prime Minister was not good. She didn't ever wear the jacket of power well. And things that I know Theresa May cared about very much so, like domestic abuse, stalking, modern slavery. She didn't use that opportunity of that time to be like, okay, while everybody's having a bitch about Brexit over here, and I recognise they all hate me on that, well, let's sweep through some of these things. I remember being in this meeting where she was like, well, we really should do something about paternity pay. And I was literally like, oh, it's almost as if you're the Prime Minister and you could do that. Like, she'd never quite felt in control, or that she had enough power behind her because of how contentious everything was to get legislation through. And because of the nature of the hung parliament, we would have just amended it within an inch of its life. And so that was difficult for her. As Home Secretary, I'd say she was at her most powerful and her most she did more good. Actually, in her term as Home Secretary, she came to visit where I worked twice, and on both occasions I was allowed to work from home. They were like, "We can't have you when the Home Secretary's here. You can't be here." She, the modern slavery bill, flawed and a bit dated as it is now, and needing some many more robust measures to stop things like British companies trading with Uyghur slave trade, for example, in the supply chain. It was world leading with regard to modern slavery, and that was Theresa May who did that. So I think I'd say if I had to rank her out of best times for T May, then I would go when she was the Home Secretary. She did the most good, although she did some crackingly bad things. The Windrush is pretty bad. Yeah, that's where I'd say she played her best furrow for good.
Brilliant, thank you. We'll go now to Paul, if you'd like to ask your question.
Yeah, first off, I want to say hi, and first off, Jess, I really appreciate your the sort of frankness and honesty with which you come across. It's quite refreshing seeing a politician. So, top marks for that. It's really nice to hear that. And perhaps for this talk, the question's quite broad and a bit off topic, but moving forward, as we're sort of obviously in the back end of the pandemic, we're sort of moving out. So moving forward, what do you see are the major political issues that we're going to have to face, and how is the Labour Party able to appeal to us as
when
voters?
When you say clinical issues, do you mean specifically like around healthcare?
I didn't mean not clinical. I mean just sort of the political issues.
Oh right, okay, sorry.
Yeah.
Okay. Oh gosh, well the political issues are plentiful, and it is how you weave the narrative of the pandemic afterwards to make sure that it doesn't happen again, and that we recover properly and equally is the main issue I feel that we're facing. But the pandemic was, to be fair to the government, nobody saw it coming. I mean, some people saw it coming. My son was obsessed with it when it was in China. I really feel like he should have been in charge of government. Like long before anyone was talking about it, my husband coughed in the kitchen, and my son like shut the door on him and said to me, "We can't go in the kitchen now. Dad has been coughing." Like he'd been watching it, I don't know where, online somewhere. I was like, "Don't be ridiculous," like back when we weren't so worried about it. Like we didn't see it coming, but there is a economic crisis that has come and is coming off the back of the pandemic, and potentially the pandemic happening at the same time as Brexit happening, that we need to be much more prepared for. So there is all sorts of cliff edges in the next year, 18 months around people's jobs, people's employment, how quick, how springy the economy is, because it will inevitably, I mean, I'm sure you're all booked into outside tables. I'm literally booked for every single night for the next 3 weeks. It's some place I'm booked to sit in the cold and eat dinner or drink beer. But how quickly, how real that is going to matter. and how other, because obviously our economy doesn't just rely on our own economy springing backwards and forwards, the global economy, and so the political issues that we're going to have to face as we come out of this is around alliances across the world, and what does Britain in the world look like now, because we sort of went a bit isolationist at a point where we also went really global because of the pandemic. And so, how Britain sits in the world, both economically and with regard to foreign affairs, and that I think is going to be a huge and political challenge that will be mired along the way with all sorts of problems. But the economic challenges that are coming, that are foreseen, politically speaking, I can see that coming. So I'm saying it to you now. Here is my flag in the sand. So the government should also see it coming. So what are they going to do to make sure that when it does happen, they don't evade the issue? And then if they do evade it, they don't evade the blame, because that is a really serious problem in our politics at the moment, is that it doesn't seem to matter how many people die. And it doesn't seem to matter if you terribly break the rules around commissioning out billions of pounds of government money. Like, everything is just like a flak jacket, and that is a political problem. And it's not just a political problem for the Labour Party. That is a political problem for our citizens. Like, that does not make for good politics. That does not make for good citizen awareness. It doesn't outcomes for our citizens that are decent, value for money, kind, caring, and considerate. So these are the big political problems that are over the next 18 months, I'd say.
Right, and now we sort of shift from the big political problem of the future
to Hartlepool.
To Hartlepool, exactly.
Global city of Hartlepool.
So yeah, what are your thoughts about the upcoming by-election in Hartlepool, especially when it comes to Labour restoring trust, or voters restoring trust in Labour?
Oh yeah, I mean, it's very unfortunate, I suppose, in the sense that it doesn't matter actually what by-elections are. Funny beasts, and by-elections in marginal seats, like Hartlepool is a marginal seat, always become nothing about the people in that place and all about a barometer for Westminster. There's nothing, I think, if I was living in Hartlepool now, there would be nothing I would find more insulting than the fact that, actually, what I want you to tell me is, are my bins going to be collected, and can I rely on people for my kids to be able to get a good school place? And actually, it's seen as being a test of Keir Starmer, and it's just like, well, actually, why isn't it a test of Lynn from Hartlepool? So that's the first thing I would say. But inevitably, this always happens. Now, there's two other by-elections actually that are going to happen on the same day. One in a very Tory stronghold in Buckinghamshire. Very sad loss of one of my colleagues, Cheryl, who died this week. Really, really sad. She was a lovely, lovely woman. And that won't be treated at all in the same way, because it's a Tory safe seat in a sort of slam dunk area. And that makes me really sad for the people who live in those two different places. That feels like the people in Buckinghamshire, their vote matters less. It's just actually we might want to speak up about what we're not happy about the government, but sort of nobody cares. And that's terrible, isn't it? That there's the media furore. It all focuses on, and that the people are the same in both those places. They're not so diametrically different that they don't just give a shit about their kids' schools and whether they can get a doctor's appointment. They care about the same things. And so I find by-elections to always be ever so slightly maddening, for this reason, that it diminishes the people behind it so often. Look, I think that it will always be seen as being a test. And let's face it, it is a bit of a test. The seat was held by Labour. It's not necessarily as simple as just looking at the last election result, because of the Brexit Party share of the vote And do I think that if we don't win in Hartlepool, that then that's it, we're never going to be able to win back the trust of people? And I actually care about winning back the trust of the people in Hartlepool just as much as I care about winning the trust of the people in Buckinghamshire. No, I don't think it does mean that if we didn't win on that day, that means it's it for the Labour Party. But that's how it will be presented by both decent analysts and those and bad faith actors in both the Labour Party and in the Conservative Party. So it's a sort of like, there's no amount that Keir Starmer can win by, actually. And it's not even Keir Starmer who's standing, is it? It's Will Williams. There's no amount that you can win, that by-election can be won by, where somebody won't say, well, this shows that the Labour Party's lost trust. So, I'll write the headlines for you already. So, I find it maddening, actually, the whole situation.
Yeah, and I think those of us who live in Canterbury know that these Tory seats is a safe Tory seat.
Yeah, but Canterbury is a really brilliant example of a seat that was Tory forever, and then one day it becomes Labour, and now it seems like it will always, I can't imagine it ever going back to being Conservative, because they're really cross, the people of Canterbury. Good on the people of Canterbury.
Yeah, Savannah, if you want to unmute yourself and ask your question.
Hi Jess, thanks again for joining us as well. I was just kind of watching the news today, and I thought, given the current situation in Northern Ireland, what do you think that the Labour Party could be doing to show the public that they are an active opposition and not just kind of sitting there?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a really good point. But funnily enough, I didn't hear the Northern Ireland minister on the radio this morning when I was listening to Radio 4, because he wasn't on. But the Shadow Minister, Lou Haig, was. And so I think that we have a responsibility to be really, really pushing the government to take serious responsibility in this area. Now, the Labour Party has a sister party in Northern Ireland. We don't stand election candidates there. The Conservative Party do. And that's a contentious issue for some people in Northern Ireland, that we don't. Lots of people would like us to. That's a debate for another 7 hours a different day. But we have a sister party in the SDLP, and I think that what the Labour Party has to do, and they are Northern Ireland's representatives. They represent the people of Northern Ireland, and they sit within a Westminster Parliament, as well as in the devolved government in Northern Ireland. And I think that the Labour Party has to very much work alongside those people who are leading on the ground in Northern Ireland and act in currency with their voices, because it's a very it would be really easy. Last night I wrote about 8 tweets and then I deleted them, because I could lay so much. I'm half Northern Irish, and I grew up in Birmingham in the Troubles. All of the people who were killed in the Birmingham pub bombings pretty much are my constituents, and I have helped represent their families who still have never seen justice for the 21 deaths meted out in the city I walk through every day. And in 2001, the last bomb of the Troubles on the mainland, I was nearly killed by. So I am a child of the Troubles in a sense. And I feel really, really cross and upset, and I feel really, really, for my dad, or for all the people, my family and friends, Belfast and Derry. I feel really, really sad to see this unfurling. And I feel like it's a failure, a political failure. And I might want to meter out criticism on some of the parties in Northern Ireland, and I might want to meter out criticism on Boris Johnson. But the criticism I have to meter out on him is inaction to do anything about it and nothing else, because I will not, no matter how much I might want to, I will not take political success by inflaming a situation that needs cool heads and calm thought, and for the winning of political points to be secondary to the safety of the people of Northern Ireland, and the people across these United Kingdoms. So, you know, I know what it feels like to feel like it is unsafe. And it's on all of us not to use it for political expediency, but to only use our platform for peace and conciliation. And so in doing that, we don't just sit there. You're absolutely right. We speak up, but we have to make sure that we are doing it to make the government act and do the right thing, not as just as a tool to criticise them.
Savannah, do you have?
Thank you. I really agree with what you're saying about us needing to listen to the lived experience of people in Northern Ireland and how important that will be to understanding the nuances of this situation in particular. But what would you say were the key triggers here? So would you think it's a bit of a Brexit backlash, a mixture of COVID burnout, or are there other external factors that have really contributed here?
You know, people aren't rioting in the streets because of COVID burnout elsewhere, are they? This is, you know, it's always fragile. You know, there's always going to be a fragility in Northern Ireland. But of course, this, you know, to say that this isn't to do with Brexit would be, well, it would be hard to it would be hard to justify the fact that the very thing that those who are rioting and perpetrating violence are saying is that they don't like the border in the Irish Sea. So it's not just Brexit, it is the deal that has been negotiated. That 4 years everybody was saying, what about the Good Friday Agreement? You know, I mean, I was really worried about a hard border on the island of Ireland, like, you know, really worried about what that would mean. And so I think that everybody became sort of obsessed with that issue, the hard border on the island of Ireland, and what the technology was going to be, you know, to get lorries over and things. And very few people then, well, not very few, lots and lots of people did. But the government just thought, oh, it's a slam dunk if we just basically make the border in the sea, even though they kept saying the border isn't in the sea. But for some people in Northern Ireland, whether you agree with their politics or not, it's deeply offensive and deeply ill thought through. And the people of Northern Ireland, when they voted, if we were to listen to their voices, when they voted in the European Union referendum, 67% of them voted to remain part of the European Union, probably because they thought this is going to be an absolute nightmare for us. And at no point did I feel like the voices of the people of Northern Ireland were being properly represented throughout listening to the lived experiences. Last night, I was just like, I made a purposeful effort to make sure that everybody, that I was following loads of people on Twitter who were directly from Northern Ireland. We should all make that commitment to do that, because, you know, we need to be listening to people who are right there, because it's very skewed perception otherwise. But yeah, I think that it's the reality is that they've not been well represented in the process. The people have, and if the truth were told, I'm not sure how well represented the people of Northern Ireland are in all UK policy making. Like, I feel like it forgets them quite a lot. Like, women in Northern Ireland, for example, don't have childcare, free childcare, whereas everywhere else in the United Kingdom we have access to free childcare, and it's a devolved issue, so you're not meant to intervene. I'm like, but hang on, UK women don't have the same rights as me as a UK woman and mother. Like, that's not okay. But we sort of go too difficult box. I have a little statue of the crane, the Belfast yellow H&W crane that sits on my desk, and it sits there that when I'm making any decision or doing anything about policy, I think I remember the people of Northern Ireland, because I don't think that their voices are heard enough.
Right, yeah. We'll now go over to Joseph. Unmute yourself and ask a question.
Hi, thanks for the talk so far. It's been really interesting. I think a key theme of what you've been talking about is of representation, and specifically underrepresentation. I think this is relevant to the electoral system, first past the post. For example, I would vote Green in an election, but I'm sort of forced to vote Labour because of tactical voting.
Yeah.
I think Labour gains a lot from this. So looking to the future, the next general election, do you think we'll see proportional representation on a Labour manifesto?
Oh, on a Labour manifesto, do I think we'll see proportional representation? The answer is no. I don't, because the vast majority of people don't actually. Most people in the country don't think about it very much until it is a much, much bigger issue, like an issue that people are going to vote on, like it's going to change the way that people vote. I don't think that. And really, we only had the referendum when we did on and actually it was a terrible system that they were suggesting, although I voted for it. I voted for it because I tend to vote for change, apart from in the case of Brexit, I did not vote for that. I like a bit of change. Yeah, I don't. The only reason we had that was because the coalition government basically, it was like their deal to prop up the Tories was to do that. And the country said, no, we're not interested in changing the voting system. And really, they don't have any appetite for it. So most people just want you to crack on with doing a better job and giving them better services, doing what you said you were going to do. They don't really care how they elect you to do it. But do I think that it will be on a Labour manifesto? I think that there's a real chance that it might be. The people of the Labour movement really, really care about, fair representation. Would it be the main ticket item? No, the answer is no. Until the electorate care most about it, then the answer would be no. But yeah, I have to say, I'm not for PR in its purest form. Because I suppose the sort of system I would prefer is not dissimilar to the Scottish system, where there is a constituency link and a list of candidates that goes on the proportion, but then there is a constituency candidate as well. Because I would never want to. I would give up my job as a member of Parliament if I was just there out of a proportion. I am elected by the people of Birmingham Yardley, and that means something to me. And there is a gold-plated element of our democracy in this country that we take for granted every single day, and no other country. Ireland slightly, but really no other country in the world has it as good as we do, and that is the direct link between a member of Parliament and their constituents. My constituents come up to me all day long. They are able to, there is plentiful time when they are able to be with me, and my gosh, do they let me know what they think. My sister-in-law is French, and she works for the local mayor in her town. And when she is in the United Kingdom, she says to me, I cannot believe that people think that you can clear their bins and come and talk to you about it. Like, we would, in France, the idea that a member of Parliament would be asked to help somebody with their passport is absolutely for the birds. Like, the fact that my constituents, I live and breathe their lives with them, is not something that any PR system offers successfully, in my view.
Right, we'll now go on for our final audience question to Clive.
Hello, Jess. I accept all your reasoning for saying that you shouldn't try and make political capital out of Northern Ireland and what's happening there at the moment, and the Brexit element of that. But do you think it's right that we are hearing so little objection to Project Fear turning into Project Reality at the moment, and there doesn't seem to be any voice pushing? I know we can't put an omelette back into an egg and rejoin Europe, but should there be? Do you think it's right not to be pushing for a closer relationship than has come out of the agreement that Johnson's arranged?
Look, I absolutely think that there is every need to push for that. I'm not sure that the public would agree with you at the moment. Not even most of those who voted Remain as well wouldn't agree with you, because it's not their top priority. And politics is always a game of priority. At the moment, I'm afraid to say it, is the pandemic is their top priority, and the economy recovering. And largely, like, being able to see the families and go to the pub. I'm not even, it sounds glib. It's not. It's genuinely the top concern of most of the people I represent. And we shouldn't always just be led by what people, politics is about leadership and taking leadership and leading from the front and getting people to agree with the things and believe in the things that you think about. Because people where I live care, more of them send me emails about bees than they do about violence against women and girls. And obviously I don't then make my political lifetime all about bees, although I'm against the neonicotinoids. But the truth is that of course we need to be out there saying that we need that what is happening in Northern Ireland, what is happening with the businesses in Birmingham Yardley, what will be happening in the businesses across the country, we need to relook at that, because it is damaging them. And this is not about saying we need to rejoin the European Union. You're not going to win that argument for a very, 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 very long time with the public. They're like, oh, don't talk to me about the European Union. They're just so bored of hearing about it, they don't want to hear about it. So we're not going to win that argument at the moment. But saying that you negotiated a bad deal that is causing danger and impoverishing British business is without question what we should and are and will be doing. Yesterday, Rachel Reeves was all across the papers talking about how the Brexit deal was bad for British business. It's you'll hear about it less than you hear about pubs opening, because people want to. Newspapers focus on what people buy, and that's what people are interested in. So but of course we should always be, no matter what deal we have, I always want a better deal for Britain. So it's not because I hate Brexit. I always think that every single deal, every single trade deal, every single alliance that Britain is in anything, I always think we should be improving on it. I always think we should be improving on what we have domestically. That's the difference between somebody who wants to make progress and somebody who wants to conserve. That's literally the point of the Labour Party existing. I always feel like there has to be forward motion. Otherwise, we will leave the people at the back of the crowd behind. So I always feel like we have to be marching forward and making things better. And even, things that the Labour Party negotiated that I might think are brilliant, I think they need to be better, always. People say to me, well, the Labour Party didn't do that. I said, well, they should have. I'm no stranger to saying that the Labour Party didn't do everything, and that it should have been better on X, Y, Z. It should, of course, it should, and so we march forward.
Right, and just one final question, because we've kept you here for long enough. As we're all university students and sort of looking forward and working into making the world a more just place, what is sort of your advice for us as we go forward?
I mean, my advice, you're already doing better than I was doing when I was at university. I was not going along and listening to politicians speaking, and so you're already doing more, like giving a shit. Like, well done for giving a shit and trying to find out more, and like trying to push people like me to do better. Like, that is the absolute thing. You should always be pushing your representatives to do better and be better. It makes them better. Genuinely, they're all frightened of you. We're genuinely frightened of the people who elect us. Like I mean, people in Birmingham Yardley could pretty much ask me for most things, and I'll be like, all right then, I'll hire a van to help you shift these slabs. Like, I am like, I am their servant. Literally, it feels like it sometimes. So, like, really push the people who represent you to do better and be better, even if they're from the political persuasion that you like. I'm not perfect. I get things wrong all the time. And so definitely do that. But also know that if you really care about an issue, it doesn't matter how big or small. It could be like, I don't know, look at bloody, what's her name? Thunberg. She's trying to change the bloody world. it could be that big, or it could be that you're, you know, pissed off about something in your local area, or that your company that you work for doesn't have a fair pay policy. Like, you know, it does, big, small. Don't think that you can't change it as a citizen, because everything that ever changed, ever, was changed by a couple of people getting together. Now, like in a WhatsApp group and going like, this is shit, isn't it? Like, that's how women got the vote. In some dusty church halls, 3 women went, oh God, this is crap, isn't it? And then organised for that to happen. That is how universal suffrage occurred. It is how abortion acts got passed. It is how we have an NHS. Like, that is, every progress that ever got made wasn't made by people in my building. It was made by people outside of the building, coming to people in my building and saying, fight for this, this is what matters. And organising. Don't expect to come to me and just be like, well, I think this, and that to be necessarily enough. Because I'll be like, okay, well, let's do that together. What are you going to do? You shouldn't expect me to do it all. What are we going to do together? Because that's how you change things. The laws that I have changed, and it feels like the greatest drug in the world when you change a law. The laws that I have changed were brought to me by some organisation where some woman usually had said, do you know what, this isn't fair. And that's what it takes. Like, you can do it. Like, and don't, the greatest tool of the established power order that has a word for people who served in the army and has a word for people who were lawyers but doesn't have a word for people like me, the gift, the greatest gift, the thing that we give them all the time that keeps them in power, is the belief that we can't change things. And we give it to them so willingly. Don't give them that gift. They want you to think that. Don't believe it. You can change anything. You can create universal healthcare for everybody in a country. You can do it.
I think that's a good place to end this conversation. Jess, thank you so much for speaking.
No worries. My pleasure.
And thank you for all the work you do in Parliament.
Also, that's my pleasure. I mean, sometimes that's less pleasurable, but it's also my pleasure.
Thank you so much.
Take care. Thanks for having me.
Bye-bye.